Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and we're back with another Why This Class is Awesome, which has been a while, almost a year. Actually, I think it has just been a year since the last Why This Class is Awesome. And I know this video is kind of coming out well after everyone else has done Kineticist videos. You're here because you either want to hear more about Kineticist or you want to hear my take on it. And as well, I'm going to state this is not a in-depth video on all things Kineticist. This is not like a 2-hour complete rundown of all their impulses or feats or all that kind of stuff. I'm just going to try to synthesize down to its base elements why the Kineticist is such an interesting and fun class. And as well, that's kind of just the thing about the series is I initially made the series to really highlight the great things about many of the classes. And Kineticist, I feel a lot of people are already really hyped for, and they don't really need this video. But for people who might be getting into the game a little bit later and who don't know about the classes, I think this is going to be the perfect video. So if you could all do me a favor, share this video around to anyone who is new, who is looking into the classes of Pathfinder, I'd really appreciate it. So let's go ahead and get started. So the Kineticist is such an interesting class because it's essentially a hybrid between a fighter and a magic caster, but not like a magus. It has fighter-like qualities while not necessarily being a fighter class, and it has magic-like qualities even though it's not a full magic class. And that will make a lot more sense as we get into it. But I will state, the Kineticist is the only class in the game, and probably the only class ever, to use Constitution as its major key attribute for the class. Now, if you're not familiar with Pathfinder, key attributes essentially where most of your class features kind of works out of. So if you're a wizard, your spell DCs, your spell modifiers, all that kind of stuff is based off of your intelligence. And if you're a sorcerer, it's based off of your charisma. And for the Kineticist, it's based off of Constitution, meaning that a optimized or more optimized style of Kineticist is going to have more HP than most classes in the game. At least all the 8 or lesser, classes, not including the few classes that go up to 10 or even 12 HP, like the Barbarian. I will also state that no matter how much you really invest in your Constitution as a Kineticist, it's not going to be the healthiest class in the game. A Barbarian who at least manages to get to 18 at any point in their adventure is just going to have more HP than you. The HP is not the point of the Kineticist. It's more of a holdover from when Kineticists in first edition used to have this burn mechanic where they could damage themselves to empower their abilities. They don't have it anymore, but this Constitution is kind of a layover from that. Regardless, there are people who wanted a Constitution-based class, and so we have a Constitution-based class. So you might be asking, why Constitution? What does it do for me? Constitution is one of the less used attributes in the game. Up until this point, really only affecting your character's HP and their Fortitude DC. Well, for the Kineticist, the Constitution modifier goes into their class DC, which is something that all classes have, but the Kineticist is unique because it is the only class in the game currently that gets up to legendary proficiency in their class DC. And they have a higher class DC overall compared to all other classes, higher on average for their level. So it doesn't really matter if you're focusing fully on Constitution, you'll still be able to do all the things that Kineticist wants to do because your major class DCs and abilities are going to be focused on your Constitution modifier. Though this does cause some issues as it doesn't make it really good for diversifying your character. If you want to have other skill sets, other abilities, you're going to have to invest in some other attributes. How a sorcerer or a bard who uses charisma can go into social skills more easily, a Kineticist is going to have a little bit more of a struggle, but overall, I don't think that's a big negative on the class. It's just something that when you're starting the class for the first time, you're really going to have to understand that in order to do things outside of Kineticist, you're going to not be as good as some of the other classes, And that's okay because you get a lot of versatility and utility through Kineticist. So, Kineticist is a class that allows you to gain magic like abilities without having to worry about spell slots. They have such good utility due to this, and they actually get more feats than any other class in the game, or at least feats relating to their class and class abilities. This allows them to have a pretty big toolkit to allow them to do a lot of things, but let's go over it kind of step by step so you can understand what I'm talking about. So when you start off as a kineticist, the first thing you're really going to decide is what gates or how many gates you want. So there's two styles of kineticist, at least at level 1. You can either be a single gate kineticist, which has only a singular element they can pull feats from and abilities and manipulate, but they have enhanced abilities around that, getting something called a impulse junction, which allows you to alter your character whenever you use an impulse with the trait of your singular element. For instance, if you have air, you can actually stride or fly, if you have a fly speed, up to half your speed before you activate an impulse whenever you're using an air impulse. That's a very big thing, and you can do it before or after the impulse, allowing you to have pretty much unmatched maneuverability. You can do this in tandem, essentially, with your blast. Every time you use one of your blasts, which is a kineticist's main form of attack, you can move half your speed, which is pretty huge. And it's a really good motivator for people to select the single gate style of kineticist. Single gate is really good if you want to be someone who uses a specific element and kind of focuses predominantly on that. But I will say, even if you go single gate, you actually still can get access to other gates later and still get really the benefits of being a single gate. The biggest difference is it's going to take more time for you to get more abilities, and you're not going to have as much kind of flexibility with what you can do as some of the other classes. But in exchange, you get the more powerful single element style build, which I think is very powerful. Then there's dual gate, which you start with 2 different elements. It doesn't do anything else, but you do start with 2, and no matter if you pick single gate or dual gate, you actually get 2 impulse feats at level 1. If you're a single gate, those 2 impulse feats come from your element, but if you're dual gate, 1 impulse must come from each of your elements. So you can't pick 2, for instance, in fire. If you pick fire metal, you have to pick 1 fire and 1 metal, which is very interesting. And I'll get to the elements in a little bit so you can kind of understand the benefits of each one. I will say, though, that having multiple gates is just as good, even if they're not individually as powerful as the single gate user. So in order to use an impulse, which an impulse is essentially just the unique action to use elemental abilities that a kineticist gets, you need to first channel elements. This gives you a kinetic aura, which is an aura that at first doesn't do anything. It just makes it apparent to everyone around you that you're doing, stuff. So you can't necessarily do kineticist stuff secretly, as you have this very obvious aura effect around you. But when you channel elements, it's actually really cool because for a single action, not only do you get to prep yourself to use your abilities, but you can also use a singular action blast, which I'll mention here in a moment, or a single action stance. And stances are also impulses as well. And most of what they do is kind of affect your aura. So essentially you can activate an aura effect for a single action, or you can have, you can blast as a part of channeling your elements. This makes the kineticists flow really easily, as they don't really lose action economy for activating this aura. Now, I will state there is something called overflow. What overflow does is after you use an impulse that has the overflow trait, you lose your kinetic aura and you have to reestablish it before you use any other impulses. But as I mentioned before, because you can channel elements and blast or use an impulse stance, you really don't lose anything by using overflow except for the ability to use back-to-back multi-action impulses that are very powerful. This is kind of the general balance of Kineticist, but it doesn't feel bad, and it doesn't feel like the Maugus's Spell Strike, which they need to use an action to recharge all the time, which is an action that doesn't do anything most of the time. This one allows you to essentially recharge and blast or attack as a part of it, which is, I think, really, really good, and it makes Kineticist flow really, really well. Now, while I'm not going to mention everything about the Kineticist base abilities, as I don't think they're necessarily important for how you look at the Kineticist, just know that you get some abilities that kind of help manipulate the elements that you're focusing on. I will say that the Elemental Blast is a different story, and it's the core element of a Kineticist. The Elemental Blast is the straight up, I'm just going to do damage with my kinetic aura. And I will also state, due to how kinetic gates work, you open a gate to a different plane of existence where the element reigns. This allows you to use fire impulses even underwater, which is something that even spellcasters can't do in the game without some kind of special features. So, Kineticists, it doesn't matter where you are, whether there's no air, whether you're underwater or whatever, you can still use your element pretty much no matter where you are. This is designed specifically so that if a character goes a singular element, they're never in a situation where they can do absolutely nothing because all their abilities have, a trait that might not work in said environment. This is very important for GMs to understand as well as players, as it pretty much just states that you can always use your element. Now, whether an enemy takes the damage from your element, that's a very different story, but no environmental thing can at least affect your elements. Now, for the blasts, and kind of what I was leading up to, you have a 1 or 2 action blast. The single action blast allows you to either at a range dictated by the element or in melee strike an enemy with your element. Now, when you do so, you use your Kineticist class modifier to do so. So no special attack modifiers, no special attack like proficiencies. This is all based purely on your class DC and modifier. Now, as you can see here by the list, I guess it'll be like over here. Yep. The list over here of elemental blasts. It's either a D6 and it goes 60 feet or a D8 and it goes 30 feet. So depending on what kind of elementalist you want to do or kineticist you want to do, you want to choose a distance that fits your playstyle, but you can actually augment these with feats later in the game. So don't think that you can't be a long distance earth user, for instance, if that's the way you really want to go. Now, if you use the 2 action elemental blast, you actually add your constitution modifier onto the damage. And I forgot to mention as well, if you're using an element in melee, you add your strength to it as well. So the Kineticist is the only class in the game currently that can add 2 attribute modifiers to their damage if they're striking in melee combat. But even at a range, you can still do a 2 action blast that adds your constitution modifier, meaning that their damage overall just is pretty good depending on what blasts you do. Now, your blasts also every 4 levels increase by a die. So by the end of the game, you're shooting enemies with 5d whatever of the element you're using. This means that the elemental or the kineticist is always capable of doing some really good damage, and because you can do this as a part of, creating your aura, channeling your elements, you have a really good damage efficiency in the game, which is really solid overall. So I did mention earlier that Kineticist gets a lot of abilities or get a lot of feats, more than any other class. They do. Not only do they get 3 feats at level 1, 2 with the 2 impulse feats and 1 class feat at level 1, plus at 5th level and every 4 levels after that, you get the ability to get another feat. Well, I should say you always get a feat, but it depends on whether you're expanding the portal, which is changing your gate and making it better, adding a gate junction, which I'll show you a list over here on the side. The gate junctions change how your blasts or how your impulses work necessarily. And when you're expanding the portal, this allows you to essentially make the elements that you can channel even stronger. This is kind of the Kineticist's overall modus operandi, where the more you focus on an element, the stronger that element gets. Now, even if you're dual gate, you can empower one of your elements by expanding one of them and giving it a gate junction. Now, whether you do expand the portal or fork the path, which fork the path allows you to get access to a new element, you get a new impulse feat at your level or lower. Now, if you're forking the path, the new element you're selecting to add to your repertoire of elements you can use, the impulse must come from that new element, and it cannot be a composite impulse, which composite impulses are special impulses that you can only select if you're using multiple gates, which is a benefit of the dual gate that we mentioned before. In any regard, no matter what you're doing, you're getting a new extra impulse feat at levels 5, 9, 13, and 17, giving you 4 additional feats on top of what you're getting for a class already every even level. This makes the Kineticist pretty much always getting something new and interesting with their class, pretty much every level, with a couple of gaps where, it's not a really big deal. And the gate junctions can allow you to customize your playstyle, focusing on expanding a singular portal of an element that you use a lot for certain things. Critical blast is a really good one because it makes it so whenever you critical using your blast ability, elemental blast, with that element, you do something special. If it's air, for instance, you push the target 10 feet, or if it's fire, the target takes a d6 persistent fire damage, and you gain an item bonus to this fire damage equal to your item bonus to impulse attacks when you're using a gate attenuator, which is a unique item that Kineticist gets. The gate attenuator allows you to essentially add item bonuses to your attacks. It also increases your constitution modifier, which is really good. Overall, the gate attenuator is essentially the same as the standard weapon runes that other classes get you can think of. It's a more complex item than that, but we're not going to get into that in this video. Just know that the gate attenuator is what the Kineticists use to add item bonuses to their attack, which is very important. So Kineticist has a lot going on. They have different elements they can do. They can either focus and make elements stronger, or expand and give themselves more tools to use in more situations. It's a lot, and you might need to watch the video a couple times to pick up everything. Just know that the biggest things is whenever you get a new element, you're adding more tools to your kit. Whenever you focus on an element, you're making those tools better. So how it fits into your playstyle is very important. It's also important to mention that when you're blasting, consider what your character's defensive capabilities are. A lot of people are very motivated to go with the strength kineticist route to do strength plus con modifier damage in melee combat. But remember, Kineticist actually only gets up to light armor proficiency normally. So without archetyping into archetype that gives you like Sentinel, that gives you extra armor proficiencies, you're going to be a little bit prone to getting critical struck in combat. And if you don't have dex to kind of match the light armor proficiency, it gets a little messy. The Kineticist suffers from what a lot of people call as MAD, or multi-attribute deficiency, where they just don't have enough attributes modifiers to do what they want to do. So you need to judge for your playstyle what you really want. If you want to play a very loose, long-range style of Kineticist, then you don't really need to worry about much besides your con and maybe your dexterity for flight acrobatics if you're going air, for instance. But if you're being upfront in combat, you might even want to take a bit of a downgrade in your con and boost your dex and strength so that you can survive more easily in combat. There's also a variety of kinetic impulses that are good for melee combat and that you should keep in mind. So overall, the Kineticist is kind of an advanced class in some ways, but when you master it, you get a lot of utility and versatility out of it. And speaking of that versatility, let's talk about reflow elements. Reflow elements is a unique feature. I should say unique, but it's how the kineticists essentially can change their impulses to match the situation. Really good if you're using multiple elements, as what it does is during your daily preparations, you can change an impulse you have to another impulse that you qualify for. Now, it does have to be from the same elemental trait, but because most of the elements have multiple things that they can do, this still gives you a lot of versatility in what you can accomplish, and it just allows you to be flexible. Considering you have so many tools in your kit, this extra flexibility just enhances the Kineticist. And on top of reflow elements, at level 17, you get double reflow, which allows you to do this with 2 impulses on your daily preparations rather than 1. So never feel like you're stuck in whatever impulses you select. At level 11 and afterwards, you're able to change them out pretty much every day to the ones that you need. So it's very good to understand that you're not stuck in whatever you're selecting. Another important thing to mention as well is your class DC lags behind other classes a little bit up until level 15. When most classes get mastery, you also get mastery in your class DC, which is really good. But up until about level 15, you're at, well, I shouldn't say up until level 15. At levels 5 to 7, because there's a lot of classes that get expertise in their weapons around level 5 or so, you're going to get yours at level 7. It's a 2 level difference, but just know in those levels, you're a little bit behind, but you catch up real quick. And you're one of the only classes that really gets legendary in their proficiency, as with the fighter gets a lot earlier than other classes. You at least get it at level 19, which most classes get only mastery ever. So something that's very important to keep in mind is you have some very potent ability to get your kinetic impulses off. That is going to be a very core element, as most kinetic abilities require the enemy to make a basic saving throw, which means even if they succeed, they still take half the effect. That's good for you because that means that you're always doing something with your impulses, even if the enemy succeeds. It doesn't do anything if the enemy crit succeeds, but that's going to be a very rare occurrence. And if the enemy ever fails, you're going to be in a really good spot to deal a lot of damage or to really mess with the enemies. That's about a lot of what makes a Kineticist. And before I get into some of my favorite feats from Kineticist, let me tell you about the elements and generally what they're good at. Now, all elements offer you some ability with utility or the ability to do some damage, mostly area damage. So what I'm mentioning here isn't the only things the elements are capable of doing, but rather the strengths of each element. Remember, it doesn't matter what elements you really select, you're always going to be capable of dealing damage with them, even if it's just with your elemental blast. So don't feel like by selecting a specific element, you're cheating yourself out of damage or even utility, as all of them do provide some level of utility and damage each. So first up is air. Air is the movement one. Many of their abilities move the character in some way or another, even getting infinite flight at level 8 with Cyclonic Assault. Very, very powerful, and with so many abilities to move themselves or even allies or enemies, it is the ultimate in repositioning. With some good attack abilities to do some damage as well, it's really good for setting that kind of stuff up. It also provides a variety of movement utility and other utilities as well, as you can even, arrest a fall, stop yourself from falling to your death or an ally, or even create things like mist. So overall, it's very movement based with some utility kind of mixed in. Earth has a heavy defensive focus. Being the most defensively focused in the game, it offers you lots of benefits, whether it's giving you resistances to damage, whether it's giving you extra AC or other abilities. As well, it has a big focus on terrain manipulation with some minor object creation, even debuffing enemies, doing things like sand, throwing them in your enemy's face, and all that kind of stuff. The earth element is really good for maintaining yourself in combat. You can make the battlefield difficult for your enemies to traverse. As well, you can create simple but maybe even helpful objects to get to specific areas for your allies who, might be a little bit movement impaired. Coupled along with their debuffing abilities, the earth is very good if you're very focused on being sturdy in combat while also aiding your allies. Fire is the most area damage focused in the game, or for Kineticists anyway, as they have the most area focused abilities. This gives them a lot of ways to do damage, do it in a different kinds of abilities. I think they're also one of the only elements that get the burst area, which allows you to shoot at a range and create a burst. Most of them are like lines or cones, meaning that you have to position yourself around your allies. Fire has a few that allow you to kind of position your explosions, which is very handy. Being the most offensively based of the elements, it's really good if you like doing damage, but it does have some really good buffing capabilities that you can add to your allies as well. So overall, fire is really good in combat, generally speaking, as well as being able to offer extra benefits to your allies. Metal is kind of a diverse style of element, as it has multiple pickings from others. It has defensive qualities similar to Earth, but it actually has a higher focus on creation utility, being able to create things like weapons or armor or even objects that you might utilize. It's very good for that fact, and its creation ability is not something to look down upon, especially because they have the ability to create precious materials, which might be the weakness of enemies you're fighting. They also have a really good offensive capability, not to the same level as fire, but more than some of the other elements, making it overall a really good kind of balance with utility and combat capabilities. A very good element and my personal favorite. Next up is water. Water is the healing focused of the elements, which is really good. And honestly, not all of the elements can heal. Only water and wood can heal. So it makes water really, really good in as being like the overall team support. Not only that, but a lot of their impulses focus on debuffing enemies and moving them around the battlefield, which kind of has some air and earth-like qualities. Overall, water is probably the best support element, though it could be argued that wood is just as good, as the wood element has a creation focus. It creates a lot of different things in the terrain. You can create different kinds of objects. It is really good at making objects in the field, probably even better than metal as far as like scale is concerned and the type of objects, though with the less like finesse. You can't create small objects like metal can, but you can do a lot of creating, a lot of battlefield manipulation similar to Earth, and it has some pretty good healing, not as good as water, but it also has good support as well. Wood is kind of one of those elements that doesn't focus on anything in particular besides maybe creating things in the environment, though it does a lot of things really, really well. So, whatever elements you pick, there's a lot of really good feats and impulses in them, and I'll just share with you guys some of my favorites, though I'm also going to look at some of the generic class ones, as if you're a single element user, you have a big focus on a singular element, the class feats are actually some of the best for your character specifically, as there are a lot of, mono element style of feats that require you only to use a singular element. So even if you're a single element user, you're still going to have a lot of impact you can bring to the game. So we're going to start off with one of my favorite feats, which is fearsome familiar. It's really good. The Kineticist can have a unique familiar type called elemental familiar. It gets some unique traits and make it slightly different than other familiars, which I think is really cool. But when you use the 6th level feat fearsome familiar, it allows you to turn your little buddy into quite a menacing foe, as you can summon or you turn your familiar as if you were using the summon elemental spell to create any creature of your level -4. The creature appears in the same space as your familiar, which then disappears for the duration of the impulse. You can sustain this impulse up to a minute, so you need to use actions to maintain this, like a normal summoning spell. And when the impulse ends, the familiar appears in the space where the elemental occupied. Now, a familiar can endure this process only so often, so if you use this impulse on your familiar more than once per day, it dies as soon as it returns the second time. So pretty much, it's a once per day, twice per day if you're desperate, though with normal for familiars, if you spend a week, you can get your familiar back, though pretty much just consider you can use this once per day. This allows you to create a lot of really interesting creatures using your familiar, and it just says when the spell ends, your familiar comes into the space. So it doesn't actually specify if the creature gets killed, for instance, by the enemy, that your familiar dies. So honestly, technically speaking, if the enemies kill your fearsome familiar, the spell ends and then your little familiar disappears in their space. So I think that's pretty cool. And it doesn't necessarily cost your familiar to use this ability, which I think is very important and very potent. Now, a really good feat, and probably one of the strongest in my opinion, is called Chain Infusion. Now, infusions are unique abilities to kineticists, I guess, Technically, I think Alchemist also has an infusion ability. Anyway, it's like meta magic. What infusions do is for an action before you use elemental blast, you can essentially cause it to chain. So you spend an action, then you elemental blast either one or two, and when you use it, if the blast hits, you can attempt a new elemental blast on a target that's within range of the blast's range, measuring from the new target. This can chain up to 5 times, I believe. Yeah, up to 5 times as long as they keep hitting. Now, each attack does apply your multi-attack penalty, but the benefit to this you have to consider is if this is like, if you're using a one action blast, right? So you use Chain Infusion, you use a one action blast. If you hit the first enemy, that cool, that gives you a chance to hit a second enemy. If you hit a second enemy, cool, that gives you a chance to hit a third enemy. And you're not likely to hit the third enemy, but as a singular action, you essentially get to attack two enemies, or I guess two actions technically. You get to hit two enemies within your range, and it can go even higher. It's a bit of a gamble, but the fact that you have the ability to hit with 5 blasts makes it really good for dealing with like the chaff on the battlefield. You hit the boss with your, zero multi attack penalty attack, and then you just keep chaining to the chaff in the battlefield, doing as much damage as you can and making your damage efficiency absolutely nuts. All this for just an additional action. It's really, really good. Now, I will say as well, the Chain Infusion can't chain back to the same enemy twice. So it has to be up to 5 different enemies. But like I said, this is really good for boss battles where there are a lot of minion enemies running around, a lot of chaff enemies running around. Overall, Chain Infusion is just really good. All right, now I could go into some of the impulses from the various, elements altogether, but they each kind of depend on what your play style is, and so I don't think necessarily me mentioning them in this video is going to be super relevant. Instead, let me talk about some of the composite feats that are in the game because they're really, really cool and they really make the Kineticist very unique in some ways as you get to kind of combine the qualities of two elements into a singular impulse. Rain of Rust uses metal, which is one of my favorite, is really cool. It's 3 actions, but you create a red cloud in a 10-foot burst up to 60 feet away, which burst is really huge because again, not many of the elements get access to burst areas, which I think is important to mention. But you rain down corrosive rain on the enemies. Any enemies wearing any kind of like metal armor gets their movements restricted, becoming clumsy 1. And considering that clumsy doesn't require any kind of reflex save or anything, that's pretty huge. Now, granted, 3 actions to make an enemy clumsy 1 isn't necessarily that important, but I will say if the enemy is wearing metal or is made of metal, it also takes 3d6 damage, no specific element. The creature just takes damage with a basic fortitude save against your class DC, plus an additional d6 persistent damage if it fails the check. Damage from this impulse ignores hardness, and because it doesn't have a particular like element, it hurts anything. It's better than even force damage. It's just pure damage. Now, it's only damage if a creature is covered in metal or wearing metal or the like, as it probably is like acid damage is like the attempt, but it doesn't state specifically. It's really good and it's very, very interesting. And there's a lot of enemies that wear armor, and it's just a solid ability. Now, yes, it is 3 actions, but I think it's definitely worth it to, slow the enemies down, deal some damage, and I just love the aesthetic of the acidic rain kind of melting down on enemies. Very, very good. Another really good composite feat to me is the Ash Strider. This is a combination of air and fire. It's really good. It's 2 actions, but it does have the overflow trait, so you're not going to be able to use another ability until you channel elements, which is really easy to do. And honestly, you could do it pretty much right after this if it's the first action on your turn. But what happens is you discorporate. You turn into a cloud of whirling ash, and then you stride. So it's 2 actions to essentially stride, but if you have a fly speed, you can fly instead. And this movement doesn't trigger any reactions. You can move through occupied spaces and even go through tiny cracks and ignore any difficult terrain and greater difficult terrain that wouldn't impede smoke. This is a good ability even outside of combat, as it allows you to essentially go under a locked door as long as there's enough space for Ash to get through, which is most, but not all. A vault's maybe not, but most doors in a place, you could totally just get on the other side real easy, which I think is really, really cool. But on top of this, on top of it being just a really good defensive action, the first creature in whose space you move through, and they don't impede you, so you don't even have to treat it as difficult terrain, they take 3d6 fire damage, an additional d6 every 2 levels after that. So pretty much every even level after that, you would select this feat. Or, well, I guess technically it's based on character level. Oh, I didn't mention that at all. So, anytime you see a heightened effect for any of the Kineticist abilities, it's using your Kineticist level rather than like a spell level where normally you see heightened effects. So, for instance, for Astrider that has level +2, that means that for at sixth level, which is when you would pick this one up, and then every 2 levels after that, or even if you select this later, at level 6 and then every 2 after that, you would add a d6 to the damage, which is really cool. It's a reflex save, which, some enemies are good at, some are not. It's one of those most enemies kind of have like a decent reflex in some regard. But regardless, it does damage in addition to being a really good defensive capability, having really good utility to move and get to places, that you would normally have a difficulty reaching. And on top of all of this, when you're done moving, you still have a cloud of ash surrounding you, and you become concealed until the start of your next turn. Meaning the enemies need to make a DC 5 flat check to even hit you with actions. This makes this really good defensively with some good offensive capability and really good utility mixed into the batch. Overall, Ash Strider is just a good example of what Kineticist is, which is a class that kind of hits the marks all over the board when it comes to abilities, defensive, offensive, and utility, all mixed into a singular ability. Hopefully this helped you guys understand the Kineticist, and hopefully I got you hyped up for getting into Kineticist. It's a very good class that is very good at what it does, which is having a tool in its belt for any situation without needing to go through all the humdrum of setting up your spell slots like many of the casters do. Now, while you don't have as many tools as casters do, you also have better combat abilities that don't require, the use of spell slots. So you are just more sustainable in most situations. And depending on what element you choose, you can even have something like infinite flight, which most casters can't even imagine having, which it just makes the Kineticist really, really good. So that's going to be it for me. Like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. I'm going to be doing more of the Rage of Elements stuff now that I've done my week and I can focus fully on work now. You can all see all the great Rage of Elements stuff I have coming out right before the book releases to the public on August 5th or 3rd. August 3rd or 5th. I can't remember, whichever. Whenever Gen Con is, which I think maybe is August 3rd. Anyway, in any regard, hope y'all enjoyed. Good luck with your games. Lead the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.